136 days. That's how long investigators have been searching for answers. 136 days with no arrest, no confirmed suspect, and no sign of 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie. But investigators do have one thing: a man caught on camera. In the early morning hours of February 1st, 2026, a masked figure appeared outside Nancy Guthrie's home in Tucson, Arizona. The time was 1:47 a.m. What happened next lasted only seconds. The man walked directly toward a security camera, not the front door, not a window, the camera. Almost immediately he disabled it. No hesitation, no searching, no second guesses. It was as if he already knew exactly where it was. And that's one of the details investigators haven't been able to ignore. Because if he knew where the camera was, what else did he know? Did he know the layout of the property? Did he know Nancy lived alone? Had he been there before? For months, investigators have worked to answer those questions. And according to sources familiar with the investigation, there's another possibility that's become increasingly difficult to dismiss. The man on that footage may not have been working alone. If that's true, then this wasn't a random crime. It was a planned operation, one that began long before a masked man appeared at Nancy Guthrie's door in the middle of the night. So who was he? How did he know the property so well? Why was Nancy Guthrie targeted? And after more than 4 months, are investigators any closer to finding the people responsible? Tonight we're taking a closer look at the evidence, the theories, and the questions that still remain unanswered. Before she became the focus of a nationwide investigation, Nancy Guthrie was simply a mother, grandmother, and longtime member of her community. At 84 years old, she was living alone in Tucson, Arizona. Friends and family described her as deeply religious, someone whose faith remained an important part of her daily life. She rarely missed Sunday Mass and maintained a routine that those close to her knew well. Nancy also relied on daily medication and had a cardiac pacemaker, details that would become critically important once investigators began trying to piece together her final known movements. Then came the early morning hours of February 1st, 2026. According to investigators, the timeline begins at 1:47 a.m. That's when a masked man appeared outside Nancy's home. Doorbell camera footage captured the individual approaching the property before moving directly toward a security camera and disabling it. After that, much of what happened remains unknown. What investigators do know is that at approximately 2:28 a.m., Nancy's cardiac pacemaker stopped transmitting data. And after that, she was gone. No confirmed sightings. No contact with family. No indication that she left voluntarily. Just silence. Investigators believe the key to understanding this case may lie in the narrow window between those two events. From the moment the suspect appeared on camera to the moment Nancy's pacemaker signal was lost, only 41 minutes passed. 41 minutes. That's the time frame investigators have spent months examining, hoping it will reveal what happened inside that home and where Nancy was taken. Because while the disappearance itself remains a mystery, the footage captured that night may have provided investigators with something just as valuable. Not a name, not a face, but a glimpse into the person responsible. And as investigators looked closer at that footage, they began noticing details that suggested this crime may have been far more carefully planned than it first appeared. For investigators, the most important witness in this case wasn't a person. It was a camera. Although the suspect covered his face, the footage captured enough details to give investigators a clearer picture of the individual they were looking for. The man seen outside Nancy Guthrie's home wasn't dressed like someone making a split-second decision. He appeared prepared. The footage showed him wearing a full face mask, gloves, and a backpack. He also appeared to be carrying a flashlight and what investigators described as a chest holster. None of those items prove who he is, but together, they tell a story. This wasn't someone who happened to be passing through the neighborhood. This was someone who arrived with a purpose. Investigators believe every item he carried served a function. The mask concealed his identity. The gloves reduced the chance of leaving evidence behind. The flashlight helped him move around the property in darkness. And then there was the backpack. One of the many questions investigators still haven't publicly answered is what, if anything, was inside it. Despite the suspect's efforts to conceal his identity, the footage also revealed several characteristics that investigators believe could eventually help identify him. A ring, a tattoo, distinctive eyebrows, and what appeared to be a mustache visible beneath the mask. Individually, those details may not seem significant. Together, they create a profile that someone may recognize. That's why investigators and the FBI have repeatedly emphasized a simple point throughout this case. Someone knows this man. Someone has seen that tattoo before. Someone may recognize the ring. Someone may remember a friend, coworker, neighbor, or relative whose appearance matches the person seen in the footage. And despite months of investigation, the images released to the public remain one of the strongest leads in the entire case. Because while the suspect successfully concealed his face, investigators don't believe he concealed everything. Just as important as what the suspect looked like was how he behaved. Nothing in the footage suggests panic. Nothing suggests hesitation. His movements appear deliberate, purposeful, controlled. Investigators say those are not the actions of someone acting on impulse. They are the actions of someone who came prepared, someone who knew what they intended to do before they ever stepped onto the property. And as investigators analyzed the footage frame by frame, one detail stood out more than anything else. Not the mask, not the backpack, not the tattoo, but what the suspect did immediately after arriving at the house. Investigators weren't just interested in what the suspect was wearing. They were interested in what he knew. Because one of the most important moments in the entire case happened within seconds of his arrival. As soon as the suspect approached the property, he moved directly toward a security camera and disabled it. There was no hesitation, no wandering around the yard, no searching for the device. He appeared to know exactly where it was located. For investigators, that raised an obvious question. How? How does someone arrive at a property in the middle of the night and immediately locate a camera they shouldn't reasonably know exists? One possibility is luck. Another is preparation. And as the investigation continued, detectives appeared to focus heavily on the second explanation. The suspect's actions suggested he may have already been familiar with the property. That familiarity could have come from previous visits. It could have come from surveillance. Or it could have come from a legitimate reason to be there before the crime ever occurred. Whatever the explanation, investigators began looking for signs that the suspect may have spent time studying the home before February 1st. And that's where an interesting detail emerged. Weeks after Nancy disappeared, investigators publicly requested surveillance footage from a very specific date, January 11th. Not January 10th, not January 12th, January 11th. The request immediately drew attention because investigators rarely focus on a single date without a reason. Authorities have never publicly explained exactly why that day was important. But many observers believe investigators may have been looking for evidence of reconnaissance activity. In other words, someone checking out the area before the crime, someone learning the layout, someone identifying cameras, entry points, and routines. Adding to that theory were reports of a suspicious individual seen in the neighborhood weeks before Nancy vanished. Witnesses described unusual behavior that stood out enough to be remembered later once the investigation became public. On its own, that observation doesn't prove anything. But investigators don't look at clues in isolation. They look for patterns. And when detectives combined the witness observations with the suspect's apparent familiarity with the property, a possible picture began to emerge. This may not have been a crime planned in a single night. The suspect may have spent days, weeks, or even longer gathering information before ever stepping onto Nancy Guthrie's property. If that's true, then the disappearance wasn't random. Nancy was chosen. The question is why? Why this home? Why this victim? And what made Nancy Guthrie the target of what investigators increasingly believe was a carefully planned operation? By this point in the investigation, detectives weren't just asking who took Nancy Guthrie. They were asking why. Because if the suspect had spent time studying the property, learning the layout, and possibly conducting surveillance beforehand, then this likely wasn't a random target. Something drew him to Nancy. One possibility investigators have considered is her connection to her daughter, Savannah Guthrie. As a longtime television journalist and nationally recognized public figure, Savannah's name is familiar to millions of Americans. And with public recognition often comes public perception. Investigators have explored whether the suspect may have believed the Guthrie family had access to significant financial resources. It's important to note that perception and reality aren't always the same thing. In cases involving ransom demands, offenders don't necessarily target people based on actual wealth. Sometimes they target people based on what they think a family can pay. And that distinction matters. Because if financial gain was the motive, Nancy herself may not have been the ultimate target. She may have been viewed as a way to reach someone else. As investigators examined that possibility, another theory began gaining attention. Not because of who the suspect was, but because of how he seemed to know so much. Several experts have suggested the individual may have had a legitimate reason to be in the area before the crime occurred. Perhaps a service worker, a handyman, a contractor, a landscaper, someone whose presence wouldn't attract attention. Someone who could move through the neighborhood without raising suspicion. The theory isn't based on a single piece of evidence. It's based on opportunity. A person working in or around the area could have observed routines, learned details about residents, and become familiar with the layout of multiple properties over time. More importantly, they could do all of that without anyone giving it a second thought. That possibility would also help explain some of the questions investigators continue to wrestle with. How did the suspect know the neighborhood? How did he appear so familiar with the property? And how was he able to move through the area without immediately drawing attention? At this stage, investigators have not publicly identified a suspect, and they have not confirmed exactly how the individual may have gathered information. But the theory remains one of several possibilities being examined. Because the more detectives looked at this case, the more it appeared that planning played a significant role. And then investigators encountered another development that added an entirely new dimension to the case: a ransom demand. One that suggested this crime may have been about far more than simply taking Nancy Guthrie. And what that demand contained surprised even experienced investigators. As investigators worked to understand who took Nancy Guthrie and why, another development added a new layer to the case: ransom demands. Not long after Nancy's disappearance became national news, messages demanding money began to surface. According to investigators, the demands weren't sent directly to the family. Instead, they were sent to media outlets. That decision immediately caught attention. Whoever sent the messages appeared to want the demands seen publicly, and the amount being requested was substantial: millions of dollars. Not in cash, not through a traditional bank transfer, but in Bitcoin. The demands also included deadlines. Then, as time passed, those deadlines changed. The amount being requested increased. The pressure intensified. For investigators, the messages created as many questions as answers. Were they legitimate? Were they sent by the person responsible for Nancy's disappearance? Or were they an attempt to exploit a high-profile case already dominating headlines? At the time, authorities were careful about drawing conclusions publicly, but investigators couldn't ignore what the messages appeared to reveal. Whoever wrote them seemed familiar with cryptocurrency. And that's significant, because carrying out a kidnapping and demanding a multi-million-dollar Bitcoin payment are two very different skill sets. One requires physical access. The other requires financial knowledge. Knowledge of digital currency, knowledge of how cryptocurrency transactions work, and knowledge of how someone might attempt to move or conceal large amounts of money. As investigators examined the evidence, a new theory began to emerge. What if the person seen on camera wasn't acting alone? What if the individual who approached Nancy's home was responsible for carrying out the operation, but someone else helped design it? Some analysts have suggested the possibility of two distinct roles: a physical offender and a planner. One person responsible for surveillance, movement, and execution. Another responsible for ransom demands, financial strategy, and communication. To be clear, investigators have not publicly confirmed that multiple offenders were involved. But the theory continues to draw attention because it could explain some of the unusual elements of the case. The suspect on camera appeared comfortable moving through the neighborhood. The ransom messages suggested a different type of expertise altogether. Could one person possess both skill sets? Absolutely. But investigators also know that criminal operations sometimes involve more than one participant, especially when money is the primary objective. And if that's what happened here, then identifying the masked man may only solve part of the mystery. Because investigators may not be searching for a single suspect, they may be searching for an entire team. The idea that more than one person may have been involved isn't just based on the ransom messages. It's based on the very different types of behavior investigators have observed throughout the case. On one side, there's the person captured on camera, the individual who physically appeared at Nancy Guthrie's home, the person who moved through the neighborhood in the early morning hours, approached the property, and disabled the security camera. That individual appeared comfortable in the environment. He seemed familiar with the area, familiar with the property, and possibly familiar with the routines of the people who lived there. If investigators are correct, those aren't traits typically associated with someone operating from a distance. Those are the traits of someone with local knowledge, someone who either spent time in the neighborhood or had a legitimate reason to be there before the crime occurred. But then there's the second side of the investigation, the ransom demands, the Bitcoin requirement, the escalating deadlines, and the decision to communicate through media outlets. Those actions suggest a completely different set of skills, not physical access, not surveillance, financial planning, digital knowledge. An understanding of cryptocurrency and how high-profile ransom cases attract public attention. For some analysts, that's where the case becomes especially interesting, because the person capable of carrying out a kidnapping isn't always the same person capable of designing a sophisticated ransom scheme. The preparation is different, the knowledge base is different, and in some cases, the criminal profile can be different as well. That doesn't mean investigators are definitely dealing with two people. One offender could possess both skill sets. It's entirely possible. But investigators can't ignore the possibility that different individuals played different roles. One person responsible for gathering information, one person responsible for execution, one person responsible for financial strategy and communication, or some combination of the three. And if that's the case, it raises another important question. How did those people find each other? Were they friends, co-workers, family members? Did they know each other personally? Or was the connection made for the purpose of committing the crime? At this stage, investigators haven't publicly answered those questions. In fact, they may still be trying to answer them themselves. Because before detectives can understand how many people were involved, they first need to understand who left evidence behind. And that brings us to one of the most important parts of the investigation, the forensic evidence. Because while witnesses can forget details and suspects can conceal their identities, physical evidence often tells its own story. And in this case, investigators believe that story may still lead them to the people responsible. For months, investigators have been trying to answer one question. Who was the person captured outside Nancy Guthrie's home? Witness statements can help. Surveillance footage can provide clues. But in cases like this, investigators often place enormous value on something else. Physical evidence. Because unlike memories, physical evidence doesn't change over time. And in the Nancy Guthrie investigation, detectives have been examining several pieces of forensic evidence they hope could eventually identify the person responsible. One of the most discussed pieces of evidence is a rootless hair recovered during the investigation. Authorities sent the hair to the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, for additional testing. At first glance, a single hair might not seem significant, but forensic experts know that even limited biological evidence can sometimes provide valuable information, particularly when modern DNA testing techniques are involved. Investigators have not publicly released every detail about the results, but authorities have indicated that forensic testing remains an active part of the case. The hair isn't the only piece of evidence drawing attention. Investigators have also discussed the presence of a mixed DNA sample that included genetic material from an unidentified individual. In other words, DNA that investigators have not been able to attribute to a known source. Naturally, that raises questions. Whose DNA is it? Is it connected to the disappearance, or is it unrelated to the crime altogether? At this stage, investigators have been careful not to draw conclusions publicly, and that's because forensic evidence often requires patience. Finding DNA is one thing, determining its significance is another. Authorities have also indicated that the DNA profile has not produced a match through CODIS, the national database used by law enforcement agencies across the United States. That doesn't mean the evidence is useless. Far from it. In many investigations, DNA doesn't immediately produce a match. Sometimes the person responsible has never been arrested. Sometimes their DNA has never been entered into a database. And sometimes investigators need to use a different approach entirely. That's where investigative genetic genealogy comes into the conversation. The technique has gained national attention in recent years after helping solve several major cold cases that had remained unsolved for decades. Instead of looking for a direct match, investigators can sometimes identify relatives and build family trees that eventually lead them to a suspect. It's a time-consuming process, But it has changed the way many investigations are conducted. Whether that approach ultimately helps solve Nancy Guthrie's case remains unknown, but investigators clearly believe the forensic evidence still has potential, and that's why the testing continues. Because while surveillance footage can suggest who a suspect might be, DNA has the potential to do something far more powerful. It can identify them. And if that happens, many of the questions surrounding this case could be answered very quickly. But not everyone believes the breakthrough will come from a laboratory. Some experts think the key to solving this case may already be out there, not hidden in a DNA profile, but hidden in plain sight. For all the attention given to DNA, surveillance footage, and forensic testing, some investigators believe the breakthrough in this case may come from something much simpler: recognition. Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer has repeatedly pointed to a possibility that many investigators quietly consider in cases like this. Somebody already knows who this person is, not because they saw him on the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared, but because they've known him for years. It's an idea that may sound obvious, but it's worth thinking about. The suspect went to significant lengths to conceal his identity. He covered his face. He arrived in the middle of the night, and he appeared to know exactly what he was doing. But despite all of that, he wasn't completely hidden. The footage still captured details: a ring, a tattoo, a mustache, his build, his mannerisms. Small things on their own, but potentially recognizable to someone who knows him personally. Investigators often say that the public doesn't solve cases by identifying strangers. They solve cases by recognizing people they already know. A coworker notices something familiar. A neighbor recognizes a distinctive feature. A friend sees a photograph and suddenly can't stop thinking about it. That's why authorities have continued releasing images from the surveillance footage. Not because the pictures clearly show the suspect's face, but because they may show enough. And investigators are hoping that enough reaches the right person. The incentive is significant. The reward fund connected to the case has grown to more than $1.2 million, one of the largest rewards associated with an active investigation of this kind. At the same time, authorities have received an enormous volume of information from the public. According to investigators, tens of thousands of tips have been submitted since Nancy's disappearance. Some were quickly ruled out. Others required additional investigation. Yet despite the number of leads, no public identification has been announced. No arrest, no named suspect, which brings investigators back to a difficult question. If the person seen on that footage is someone known to others, why hasn't he been identified? Is it because nobody recognizes him? Or because someone does? It's a question investigators continue to wrestle with. Because history has shown that many major cases are ultimately solved when someone decides to share information they had all along. And while investigators continue waiting for that breakthrough, another theory has emerged. One that attempts to answer a different question entirely. Not who committed the crime, but what may have happened after Nancy Guthrie disappeared. As the investigation continued, another theory began attracting attention, not because it was supported by definitive evidence, but because of the questions it raised. According to multiple reports, anonymous calls and tips suggested that Nancy Guthrie's remains could have been taken across the border into Mexico and buried there. The claims were serious enough that they prompted additional search efforts. But they also came with an immediate challenge. Anonymous tips can be valuable. They can also be completely wrong. Investigators have to treat them carefully, ignore them, and a critical lead could be missed. Chase every one of them, and valuable time and resources can disappear quickly. In this case, search efforts moved forward. Volunteer search organizations became involved. Teams conducted searches in areas connected to the information they had received. The goal was simple: determine whether there was anything credible behind the claims. During those efforts, searchers made discoveries that highlighted just how difficult this investigation could be. Numerous unmarked graves were located. Each one represented a potential lead. Each one required attention, and each one carried the possibility of providing answers. But as the work continued, investigators faced the same outcome again and again. None of the graves that were examined were confirmed to be connected to Nancy Guthrie. The searches produced findings, just not the finding everyone was looking for. Even so, investigators couldn't completely dismiss the information. Because the existence of a false lead and the existence of an informed lead are not the same thing. The central question remained: how did the caller know what they claimed to know? Were they guessing, repeating rumors, or did they possess information that had not been made public? At this stage, authorities have not publicly confirmed that Nancy was taken to Mexico, nor have they confirmed that the anonymous tips were accurate. But the theory continues to receive attention because it intersects with several other aspects of the case. If investigators are correct that the suspect had local knowledge, familiarity with the region, and time to plan, then moving evidence or remains to a remote location would not be impossible, especially if more than one person was involved. Again, that's a theory, not a conclusion. But it illustrates how investigators are forced to examine every plausible possibility when dealing with a case that still has so many unanswered questions. And while search teams focused on where Nancy may have been taken, behavioral analysts were focused on something else entirely: the suspect himself, because according to several experts, the actions captured on surveillance footage may reveal far more about the offender than most people realize. By this stage of the investigation, authorities weren't just looking at physical evidence, they were also looking at behavior. Because long before a suspect is identified, the decisions they make can reveal a surprising amount about how they think. One expert who has weighed in on the case is Dr. Ann Burgess, a researcher whose work has helped shape modern criminal profiling. Rather than focusing on who the suspect might be, Burgess focused on what the suspect's actions appeared to reveal, and one detail stood out immediately: the timing. According to investigators, the suspect arrived at Nancy Guthrie's home at approximately 1:47 a.m. That's not necessarily unusual by itself. But behavioral analysts often look at timing as a window into planning. People acting impulsively tend to make mistakes. They react to opportunities. They improvise. This suspect appeared to do the opposite. The timing suggests he arrived when he believed the risk of being seen was low and the likelihood of interruption was minimal. Then there was the equipment: the mask, the gloves, the flashlight, the backpack. Each item appears to have served a purpose. Taken together, they suggest preparation rather than spontaneity. Investigators have never claimed that these items prove professional training, but they do indicate forethought. The suspect didn't appear to arrive and figure things out as he went. He arrived with a plan. Another detail that caught the attention of analysts was the way the camera was handled. According to investigators, the suspect disabled the camera almost immediately after reaching the property. In some accounts of the case, analysts have pointed out that the camera was effectively neutralized more than once, suggesting a level of caution that goes beyond simple concealment. If that's accurate, it may indicate something important. The suspect wasn't just trying to avoid being identified. He was trying to make sure he wasn't identified. There's a difference. One is reactive, the other is deliberate. Taken together, these actions point toward a person who appears organized, methodical, and focused on reducing risk. Someone who spent time thinking about the operation before carrying it out. Of course, profiling has limitations. Behavioral analysis can help narrow possibilities. It cannot identify a suspect on its own, but it can help investigators understand the type of offender they may be dealing with. And that's important, because when analysts compare this case to broader criminal trends, they see something that extends beyond a single suspect or a single neighborhood. They see a pattern, one that may help explain how a crime like this could have been planned in the first place. And that larger pattern may reveal where this case truly began. As investigators continued examining the evidence, some analysts began asking a broader question. What if this case wasn't entirely unique? What if the tactics seen here resembled a criminal model that's becoming increasingly common? One theory that has been discussed in connection with cases involving ransom demands is sometimes referred to as a wrench attack by proxy. The name comes from a simple idea. Instead of targeting money directly, offenders target a person connected to someone they believe has money. The victim becomes leverage. The goal isn't necessarily the victim. The goal is pressure. In cases like these, the offender's success depends on one assumption: that the family will do whatever it takes to protect the person they've targeted. It's a strategy that doesn't require hacking a bank account or breaking through sophisticated security systems. It relies on human emotion, and that's what has drawn attention in the Nancy Guthrie case. Because if financial gain was the motive, Nancy may have represented something more than an individual target. She may have been viewed as a pathway to someone else. Over the past several years, investigators around the world have seen an increase in crimes that blend traditional criminal tactics with modern financial demands. Gather information first. Identify a potential target. Study routines. Develop a plan. Then use fear, urgency, and financial pressure to achieve an objective. When analysts compare that model to some of the details in this case, certain similarities stand out. There appears to have been intelligence gathering. There appears to have been planning, and there appears to have been an effort to create financial leverage through the ransom demands. That doesn't prove the theory, but it does explain why some investigators continue to consider it, especially when viewed alongside the possibility that more than one person was involved. In that type of criminal model, responsibilities are often divided. One person gathers information, one person handles logistics, one person carries out the operation, and another may be responsible for communication or financial demands. Whether that happened here remains unknown, but it offers one possible explanation for some of the unusual elements of the case. It also brings investigators back to the question of why Nancy Guthrie may have been selected. If the offender believed the family had significant financial resources, Nancy's age and circumstances may have made her appear vulnerable. Her connection to a nationally recognized public figure may have made the family appear attractive to someone motivated by money. Again, those are investigative theories, not established facts, but they help explain why detectives continue examining every aspect of the planning that appears to have gone into this crime. And after months of searching, thousands of tips, forensic testing, and countless investigative hours, the case ultimately comes back to one question. A question that still has no answer. Who was the man captured on that camera? More than 4 months after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, investigators still don't have all the answers. What they do have is evidence. A suspect who appeared prepared, a man who seemed to know the property, a crime that appears to have involved planning long before February 1st. But some of the most important questions remain unanswered. Who was the man on the camera? What happened to Nancy Guthrie? And was anyone else involved? For now, those answers remain out of reach. But somewhere, someone may already know the person investigators have spent months trying to identify. A ring, a tattoo, a mustache. Details that may seem insignificant to most people, but could mean everything to the right person. The forensic testing continues. The reward remains unclaimed, and investigators are still waiting for the lead that finally breaks the case open. Because after all this time, the mystery remains the same. A masked man walked onto Nancy Guthrie's property at 1:47 in the morning, and more than 4 months later, investigators are still trying to find out who he was.